Joining me now is the Republican senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. He is the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, joins us live here on the Hill. Senator, thanks for being with us tonight. Appreciate it.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Of course, Pete Hegseth, you went into this hearing supporting him. Anything change your mind?
You know, I first met Pete Hegseth maybe a decade before he was on Fox with concerned veterans, and I knew him and appreciated his work, never saw anything untoward. And what I would say is that I liked him because he was not only a combat veteran, but someone who had a healthy respect for war and for not being eager to put people into combat and thinking of war as the last resort, not the first resort. That's the kind of, I think, rational, reasonable person I want at the Pentagon, not someone eager to put us in so many wars, but really to try to keep us out of war, to keep us strong enough to defeat any enemy, but not to be eager to jump into every conflict around the world.
Senator, you are one up on the Hill who always or often talks about cutting spending and the need to get a hold of spending. When you jumped into the United States Senate, the Pentagon's budget was at around $750 billion. It's now north of $820 billion, expected to go higher. I see you responding there because you know where I'm headed, which is when Pete Hegseth, if he is confirmed and he sits across from the then Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, should he tell him, Mr. President, we need to cut the Pentagon's budget?
Well, hopefully there'll be many voices around the president saying that we cannot spend our way to victory, that in fact it endangers our national security to keep going farther into debt. We spend more as a country than the next 10 countries combined. So there's not an absence or a dearth of spending. I'm for auditing the military, yes. So I'm a deficit hawk. I think that the debt, the overwhelming accumulation of debt is a threat to our national security. Yes, we can spend less and have a stronger military. There's a lot of waste in the military. And there's a lot of old-fashioned thinking, fighting the last war, not the next war. We now have drones in the Ukraine-Russia war. We have $400 drones that can take out $2.3 million tanks. The same is going to occur with our ships. The same is going to occur with all the battlefields. So we need to modernize and not just think more of everything is better, but also within the military, we still have the occasional $400 hammer and $300 wrench. What we need is competitive bidding. There's all kinds of reforms we could bring to the military. Look, I think space travel is important and NASA is important, but what Musk brought was competitive contracts. We should do that in the military, too.
I laid out there some of the headlines, Senator, in the South China Morning Post today as all this was playing out in Washington, and it struck me the way that China is being positioned there. Tariffs and trade we always talk about with Donald Trump, but I wonder, Senator, if that's going to be the big story before the next commander-in-chief, or could it be Taiwan and a possible invasion there?
You know, I think no one knows, and everybody wants the United States to be strong enough to respond to any peer competitor like China or Russia, and we should be strong enough to defend ourselves and to deter attacks. But we shouldn't forget that diplomacy is important as well. I want an ambassador to China that talks about more trade. When Janet Yellen and Blinken went to China under Biden, they went over there and they shook their fist and they insulted the Chinese and told them to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia to use in the war. I would do the opposite. I would go to China and say, what is it that we can do to make trade better and to enhance your trade such that maybe in exchange we can get you to agree not to sell dual-use parts to Ukraine? So there needs to be more carrot and stick. We got plenty of stick, but nobody offering carrot. Trade with China as well as trade with the world is good for the American consumer. It's good for prosperity. We all grow richer. Trade is not one-sided. This is where I disagree with Donald Trump. It's not a lose situation with China. Everything we buy from China, we want the product more than we want our cash. That's the way trade works. As long as it's voluntary, trade is good.
I'm looking at the right side of our screen as of course, we continue here on NewsNation, and those listening to us, Senator, on Sirius XM. Continue to keep our eyes there on Southern California. I was reading an op-ed that you wrote on the Hill, thehill.com, back in September of 2017, Senator, and you wrote back then, quote, paying for emergency funds that we should be paying for emergency funds from elsewhere, and your voting record sticks up to that. December 2012, for example, you voted against the Hurricane Sandy bill. In October 2018, you voted against the funding for Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria. There were also wildfires ongoing at the time as well. There's a conversation now, Senator Paul, about with Republicans in this town, and now they're saying, you know what? If there is a massive federal aid package to California, there needs to be cuts. This has been your position for more than a decade now, give or take. If it's still your position today, what do you think needs to be cut?
Well, think about it. Just before Christmas, they got $100 billion in more disaster aid for North Carolina. That's probably $50 billion more than they needed. So there's probably a surplus still in the disaster fund. But if you're going to do another 100 or 200 billion, I absolutely still agree with that. Take it from somewhere else. So, for example, I like to juxtapose money being, let me finish. I like to juxtapose money being sent to Ukraine. So I go to the mountains of Appalachia, whether it's on the North Carolina side or Kentucky side, and I ask people, would you rather the money be sent on fixing your roads and fixing all the storm damage here, or would you rather send it to Ukraine? And I don't find one person in all of Appalachia that wants to send it to Ukraine. So in Washington, the majority still want to send your money to Ukraine. At home, nobody does.
Do you find it hypocritical among your colleagues, Senator, some of those who have voted for this in the past but are now saying, you know what, stipulations or strings should be attached?
You know, maybe. I think it's hypocritical to vote for money for Ukraine and then vote for money for North Carolina and then complain to people like me saying, oh, we never pay for things like this. No, it is. There's a finite amount of money. And so borrowing money is not a good idea. The other thing we should do with natural disasters, because we're declaring a lot more, and I'm not downplaying what's happening in California, it's a tragedy, it's terrible. But as we declare more and more disasters, you have to split the money more between the federal government and the state government. The state governments need a much bigger chunk of the money being used to help people because state governments don't have a Federal Reserve, they don't have a printing press, and by their very nature are more conservative than the federal government. So instead of federal aid after disasters being 75% federal and 25% state, it ought to at the very least be 50-50. That alone would bring some frugality to the way we treat disasters.
Senator Rand Paul, got to leave it there. Appreciate your time, sir. Thanks for being with us here on the Hill on NewsNation. Hope you come on back. Thank you for watching, and make sure you go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.